Of our webinar series co-hosted by the Institute for Christian Socialism and the Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice at Vanderbilt Divinity School. I'm Josh Davis, your moderator for the evening, and I am the Executive Director of the Institute for Christian Socialism, or ICS. Our topic this evening is how can Christian socialists build deeper solidarities? I hope that you were able to join us for the previous webinar, where our topic was what Christianities and socialisms have to do with one another. And our next and final webinar will take up the question of what is to be done. ICS and Wendland-Cook are excited about our partnership in bringing you these webinars because both of our organizations are committed to educating, nurturing, and helping to organize Christians to take public action in support of political and economic justice. And this webinar is an extension of that work. One of the most important factors influencing those of us who co-founded ICS is the central role that Christian churches play in the vast network of organized power built by the right wing in the US over the last 40 to 50 years. That network, as Nancy McLean has documented in Democracy in Chains, is made up of layers and layers of educational institutions, policy think tanks, nonprofit organizations, political institutions, all network together, and all of which seamlessly interweave Christianity and right-wing politics in the minds of many. Not only is this a mockery of the Christian faith we believe, but it is devastating to the common good. Nevertheless, many progressive and left-leaning Christians have learned all too well from the right wing's playbook to see political power only as oppressive and dominating, something that's only used to exclude rather than as emancipatory service to the good of all. This is where our topic for tonight becomes central. If Christians on the left are to combat the influence of the right wing among other Christians and reverse its political influence, then this will be because Christians themselves play a central role in organizing power and making connections of deep solidarity. Jörg Rieger coined this term deep solidarities to point to, quote, the understanding that nothing will change unless we're all addressing the problems of the world together. So each of our guests tonight will speak to this role of Christians in building deep solidarities, drawing on their own experiences and activism to do so. So our conversation will explore what that means and why it's so important. And so with that, let me introduce our guests. First, Obery Henricks, a member of the ICS Advisory Board who teaches religion and African American studies at Columbia University and Union Theological Seminary. He's taught at Drew University and served as president of Payne Theological Seminary, the oldest African American theological institution in the US. Sarah Ngu is the community director on the executive council at Forefront Brooklyn Church and co-founded Church Clarity, a database that scores churches for how easy it is to find their LGBTQ and women in leadership policies on their websites. Sarah's writing has appeared in The Guardian, Vox, Jacobin, Slant, and many other publications. Jeremy Posadas is the director of gender studies and holds the John F. Anderson Chair of Christian Thought at Austin College. He previously worked in both congregation-based and labor organizing work. Lastly, Timothy Eberhart is the co-chair of the board of directors of ICS and the Murray H. Leifer Associate Professor of Public Theology and Ecology at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary, where he directs the Master of Arts in Public Ministry program and oversees a concentration in ecological regeneration. Welcome to you all. I'm so glad you're here. And thank you to everyone in the audience. And we want you all to know that we hope there will be time for questions at the end, and we will be taking them all along the way. But if we have time, we may not be able to, we'll do what we can to get to them, but we may not actually get there. So thank you very much. So our first question is directed at you, Sarah. I'd like you to answer first. I'm going to ask this question to all of our guests, but I'd like to begin by quoting something from the piece you wrote in preparation for tonight. You wrote, quote, "Cultivating honest, trusting relationships is the bread and butter of the church, but we must go further," you say, and ask the questions, who owns the means of economic production, of reproduction, of war, and who doesn't? In examining the white supremacist logic of chattel slavery, displacement of indigenous people from their lands, and suppression of femme and gender diverse shamans, and the plundering of natural resources and raping of women abroad. Such an analysis and education will channel the relational energy cultivated by the church into a more organized, disciplined, and sustained operation, one that will truly become the corporal body of Christ. I think these words really resonate well with our theme for tonight of deep solidarities. And so I'd like to begin tonight by asking you, and I'll ask all the other guests to answer this as well. What do you understand deep solidarities to mean? And why is a politics of deep solidarity so essential today for both socialists and Christians?
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. My cat is here. Hopefully he wouldn't be too much of a disturbance. Deep solidarities, I'm afraid part of what I will respond will mostly be a rephrase of my article. I'll try to add some new things for those of us who read it already. The word solidarity is used a lot, and whenever I hear it used, I try to get people to define it a little bit more. And the last time I heard it used was actually on a panel I was on to talk about, similar to this, a teach-in, a webinar. That time it was on responding to anti-Asian violence and building kind of cross-racial solidarity, in particular between Black and Asian communities. And the person who convened it was a friend of mine, a queer Black woman who I met through queer Christian conferences. And she talked about how solidarity is about building relationships and how can we build relationships. She said, if growing up, most of my experience of Asian Americans is through, a bulletproof glass in which I, purchase or make purchases and stuff like that. And I was thinking about it, and I was thinking about how relationships is, as I mentioned, I quote, so central to the church and how it operates. And I think it's central to any kind of mass political movement. But I think when I think about a deeper kind of solidarity, it's relationships, I think, plus a political analysis. And I think leftists tend to talk about the analysis more than the relationships, and churches tend to talk about the relationships more than analysis. But, in that conversation, I was trying to figure out, how do we go beyond, I'm friends with you and I hear your story and hear your pain, and you hear my story and hear my pain, but how do we think about ways in which, in this particular case, we are pitted against each other through certain, logics of capitalism that decide who gets to have a loan, who gets to be the visual face of, predatory capitalism, while not necessarily being the originator of it. And the example I gave in that audience was around the tax collector's relationship to Roman Empire. And so hopefully that analysis helps people understand that solidarity is more than just because I'm friends with you and we have to call it to love our neighbor and empathy, but solidarity, I think, is also about seeing your vested self-interest in this larger project, and that actually by working for your liberation, I'm working for my own as well. So that's my take.
Yeah, in one of your other pieces, in this one too, you call attention to the fact that there's something about solidarity, political solidarity, that is like a church, that's church-like. I recall in one of your pieces, you were talking about how singing Solidarity Forever was a bit like singing a hymn in church and this kind of thing. But I think you're right that there's a way in which political work is associated with analysis and not relationship building, and vice versa. But getting churches to think that about the nature of political analysis is very important. Obery, how would you answer this question?
Repose the question.
Yeah. So what do you understand deep solidarities to mean? And why is a politics of deep solidarity so essential today for socialists and Christians?
Well, understand and deep solidarity to mean really to be based on, in our context, in a Christian, be based on Jesus, his restatement of Leviticus, person of Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. And when you couple that with the fact that mishpat, justice, is the most often cited and the most basic conceptual term of the Bible, most cited ethical term, foundational ethical term. You put the two together, love your neighbor as yourself, and the concept of justice, you get egalitarian justice. And that is what socialism is based on. You know, in theological terms, we believe that everyone can have the same right and opportunity to eat of the good things of the tree of life. In terms of those who are not Christians, those who are struggling, and I hope I'm not straying from the question.
No, not at all.
Those who are not Christians, I think it's important to look to take a cue from history, and realize that, you know, throughout history, the most healthy societies have been those kinds of societies that are most focused on the common good, because if the least of these are taken care of, then, you know, those who are better off will be better off, and they'll be more, and it'll be healthier. It's just not possible really to have a healthy society without a focus on the common good. And so that's why it's a benefit to humanity, all of humanity, to think about, you know, deep solidarity, solidaristic interaction and relationships. And you know, I'm not talking from a sentimental perspective. You know, deep active level. We look out for each other. We want the same things for our neighbors and their families and their communities as we want for our own.
Yeah, you mentioned Mishpat, and reminded of your book, The Politics of Jesus, right? And the ways in which you talk about Jesus as a revolutionary and those connections there. So thank you for that. It's I got the book just right over my shoulder here. Jeremy, how would you answer this question? What do you understand deep solidarity to mean, and why is a politics of deep solidarity so essential for socialists and Christians?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I just want to thank both Wendland-Cook and also ICS for being able to be part of this. And it's such an honor to be with my fellow panelists for this conversation on such a crucial topic. I've done a lot of work with Wendland-Cook, and so my thinking has been influenced very much by Jorg Rieger and Rosemary Henkel-Rieger's work on this concept of deep solidarity. So I want to, earlier in the chat, I put a link up to their book, Unified We Are a Force, which really lays their model out really nicely. And I just want to give a shout out to that book. For me, what I find most incisive from Jorg and Rosemary's ideas, among other things, is their notion of deep solidarity pushes us to say it's really intended to contrast with both charity and advocacy models of social change, both of which the charity model and the advocacy model tend to reinforce existing inequalities and power asymmetries, while also attempting to build something like solidarity. But what I also appreciate is that it's based not on a sense of, it actually works outside the logic of identifying who has privilege, who has less privilege, sort of comparing privilege sizes and then deciding what solidarity is possible given comparative privilege sizes, which is only a few steps removed from the Olympics of oppression. And instead, the deep part of deep solidarity, if I understand correctly, is that it's about acknowledging the ways all of us, by our very being, we can't even enter into relationship with each other without already being formed by multiple systems that keep us oppressed and keep us implicit in relations of oppression. So it's a way of saying the only way we can possibly come together politically is to recognize our mutual survival is on the line together. That is, that none of us can free ourselves unless we're committed to all of us freeing one another together. So for me, that's a big part of it. And I would just want to add something that I've been thinking about as a correlate to deep solidarity in recent years, and that is we have a really great politics around intersectionality, that is understanding how different dimensions of injustice connect with one another and target people in multiple dimensions of their identity. What I think has been missing, and a correlate that's important, is some concept that names how particular mechanisms of injustice can simultaneously target groups across multiple identities, right? So if I can, I'll just give one quick example, and that is in the same span of the past few years, we've seen, with regard to trans exclusion, legislators pushing bills that, among other things, really limit trans people's access to the basic function of a bathroom. And about 4 years ago or 5 years ago, Oxfam International came out with a report about how the poultry industry regularly denies its workers even the possibility of a bathroom break. Now, the ways those two realities were circulated among activists and progressives were very removed from each other. But the bottom line is the mechanism of denying a basic access to a basic bodily function was the same. So for me, part of solidarity is also searching for the ways that mechanisms of injustice cut across identities and create the possibility of shared identities of resistance. And so the term that I've named, I'm just putting in the chat there, but I've been playing around with this term of condisposability, right? What are the ways that different identities are together made disposable through shared mechanisms? And I think deep solidarity is what emerges when we take intersectionality and condisposability and have them together as our two lenses of analysis.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Yeah, thank you. Tim, what would you add? What do you understand deep solidarities to mean, and why is a politics of deep solidarities so essential for socialists and Christians?
Thanks, Josh, and with Jeremy, very honored to be on this panel with each of my co-guests. Just a bit about my background first to situate me. I grew up in South Dakota. I'm the son of two United Methodist pastors and the grandson of 4 grandparents who were members of an ethnic group called Germans from Russia. Going back several hundred years and probably more, my people were mostly peasant farmers, some artisans, and they first migrated from Germany in the late 1700s to the Black Sea region, and then again in the late 1800s to the Americas, with many settling in the Midwest, thus the name Germans from Russia. Most were Lutheran pietists, Mennonites, a few Catholics, and they left Germany to escape the military draft amidst massive crop failures following the devastation of the countryside during the Napoleonic Wars. Now, in both Germany and Russia, from what I understand, they lived in what you would call now agricultural communes. So they shared the land, work, and the fruits of the land together in common. After migrating to the US with the promise of land through the Homestead Act, it was actually difficult legally to set up the same kind of cooperative life here. So those impulses were expressed through the pooling of resources for barn raisings, in working together at harvest time, through producer and purchasing cooperatives, public banks, and many were prairie populists who organized against private banking and railroad interests. Now, I share all that to note that my ancestral Christian socialist roots run deep, most likely back to the peasant rebellions in Central Europe at the very beginnings of capitalism, with the very first land enclosures. I also share it to highlight an important aspect of solidarity that I wrote about in my piece, and that is human solidarity with the land. That may sound strange at first, but the wisdom of cooperating with rather than working against more than human nature is basic to all indigenous cultures of every continent, including Europe. And the reality is that every adjective that we might use to describe how we as workers feel under capitalism: overworked, exhausted, fragmented, near or already past the point of collapse. These are all accurate descriptions of what's happening at the planetary level as well, right? Runaway climate change, biodiversity collapse, the depletion of soil health worldwide, and so much more. So solidarity for me, ultimately, is about recognizing and acting on the reality that all of life interconnected. This was King's insight. That the flourishing of any one of us depends on the well-being of all. That's true socially, it's true spiritually, and it's true ecologically as well. So not just socialism, ultimately, as I wrote about, but a radical eco-socialism is what I believe is desperately needed today.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. One of the questions that has popped up from the attendees is a question specifically about whether solidarity means class solidarity, and I think we've already begun to explore what this means and how these are intersected, and I want us to begin to kind of unravel this over the course of our time together, and I think we're really touching on something that's central about the nature of Christian socialism and deep solidarities and how these converge with one another. And Tim, you mentioned Martin Luther King, and I think it's a nice segue to my next question, which I'm going to direct first to Obery. And in your recent piece, Obery, at the Bias magazine, reflecting on the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., you called attention to the connection between King's Poor People's Campaign and its inspiration by the Bonus Marchers, who had pushed FDR in ways that effectively transformed US society. But you noted that King was looking for something greater with the Poor People's Campaign. He wanted to, quote, find something that's so possible, so achievable, so pure, so simple that even the backlash can't do much to deny it, because it appealed to the interests of the 28 million or so Americans then living below the poverty line. And then you go on to note that the specific things that King wanted were goals that were explicitly tied to democratic socialism. And so my question to you is, and it may not be initially what it appears to be, many people today resist adopting socialist politics on the grounds that oppressions of race, gender, sexuality, colonialism, and ecology can't be explained solely in terms of an economic system or class politics. King clearly saw the civil rights struggle and economic exploitation as bound up with one another. And so my next question is not whether the charge of economic reductionism is right, but why is it that a truly socialist politics must be an emancipatory politics rooted in a coalition of deep solidarities like the one that King was pursuing with the Poor People's Campaign? Obery?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd like to echo my colleagues about how happy I am to be here, and also how really thrilled I am to be on the advisory board, sort of an answer to a prayer, I might say. So let's make sure that I did not forget the question. The reason why politics must be based on emancipatory politics.
Yeah, the boil down to why should a socialist politics be an emancipatory politics? There's a lot of folks out there, for example, that might say a socialist politics just needs to be concerned with the working class and concerns with like trans issues or even ecology might be a distraction from the more fundamental issues. But it seems to me that what you were pointing to there with King's Poor People's Campaign was one which was deeply connecting a socialist politics to an emancipatory politics rooted in a coalition of these deep solidarities that we're discussing.
Well, you know, in the Institute for Christian Socialism, we're talking about Christian socialism. And, you know, our Christian socialist politics, first off, let me say this. I think socialist politics and New Testament, the foundational New Testament ethics, I don't think that they are identical. I wouldn't do that. But I do think that there are some great similarities. And Christian socialist politics really have to be based on egalitarian justice. in order to be Christian, and in order to really to be socialist and to be part. And so that means that if we're talking about egalitarian justice, everyone getting an opportunity to eat of the fruit of the tree of life. If we're talking about that, we're talking about wanting everyone, all of our neighbors, to have the same opportunities to a decent life and health and wholeness and happiness, then that requires an emancipatory politics, to remove the obstacles, the social, economic, and political obstacles from them experiencing these. And I recall in Jesus' manifesto, he tells us in his first sermon, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to anoint me to bring good news to the poor. What's good news to the poor is not, the current poor becoming rich and then more poor people coming after them, because that's not good news to them. It's really must be talking about structural change, structural emancipatory change, because he goes on to talk about, Jesus goes on to talk about liberation for the oppressed. So in a nutshell, I would say that in order to be a real Christian socialist politic, has to be an emancipatory politic, because if not, then we're talking about leaving some folk behind, and that is not consistent with the ethical vision of our faith leaders.
Yeah, thank you. Jeremy, what would you add here? Why is it that a socialist politics must be an emancipatory politics rooted in deep solidarities?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I really resonate so much, Obery, and I appreciate your acknowledging this is a long struggle, and there have, for a long time, at least in US history, certainly been many movements that have been straining to create these connections. So I really appreciate that. I would say two things. First of all, there's internal to socialist politics, if it's anything else, it's an emphasis on thinking about creating power for workers to guide their own destinies, right? And there's got to be some honesty that in this day and age, the working class is multiracial, multigendered, multisexual, right? And the diversity of the working class and honesty about that is one of the first steps for a legitimate socialist politics. That is to say, a socialist politics that isn't engaging the fullness of our identities, our intersectional and condisposable identities, is not actually a socialist politics. It's some kind of faux wannabe socialism, if we're just going to be blunt. And the second thing I would say is this, and that is that socialist politics names capitalism as a central mechanism of injustice. And as I'm laying out in the series that Aaron Anderson posted the link to, a series I'm doing for the Bias magazine, part of the work I'm trying to do in that series is to acknowledge capitalism can't do its work without drawing into confederacy white supremacy and patriarchy and ableism and colonialism. So part of it is there isn't an effective anti-capitalist politics available that's not also engaging these other things. And so for me, it's not a question of either or. It's about actually being honest, not just honest, but forthright and fully embracing what socialism is about. It's about the totality of social freedom. And that's only possible if we embrace the totality of the identities for which we want freedom for all people.
That's great. I mean, and one of the things I'd like to keep before us as we continue to address this question is, why is it that, say, for example, a purely class politics is not adequate to that socialist aim? And why does the Christian component of this, what is the specifically Christian component of this? One of the commenters has pointed out the concern that we not just simply replace socialism or replace Christianity with socialism. I think this is something for us to continue to explore here. I'm going to pass it to you, Tim. What do you think? Why is it that a truly socialist politic must be a fully emancipatory politics?
Well, I mean, in deep agreement with what's already been said, all of these are tied together. Racism, gender hierarchies, the colonial stealth of lands privatized and then exploited for financial profit, the rise of policing and carceral systems. each of these emerges in and through the others. I mean, they're all deeply enmeshed. So the lie that race is an accurate way of determining difference, that you can separate human beings into ranked categories of an intelligence and capability by skin color. The emergence of that wicked lie cannot be understood apart from the need to justify why it's somehow acceptable to remove some people from their native lands, and somehow natural to steal other people's from their lands, to work under horrific conditions, unfree with no compensation, right? So the lie of racial difference and racial hierarchies is integral to the colonial project, which is powered by capitalist accumulation. This is the lie that turned my great-great-grandparents from being ethnic Germans, sometimes confused as Ruskies because of the way they dressed, to my parents, and even more my generation, being socially constructed as white. That transformation, even from the beginning, was crucial. Because even as I want to embrace the communitarian elements of my heritage, the truth is that race and racism were essential in justifying the genocidal displacement of the Sioux, the Lakota, the Huron, the Mandan, and other native peoples from the lands that my peoples then settled. And it served to explain why our people would benefit from the Homestead Act, while at the same time, it just made sense that those who were formerly enslaved in the South would be denied 40 acres and a mule. And why those of Asian descent building the railroads across the prairies didn't equally deserve a home on the range. It's the same damn lie that functions to justify the shooting of yet another unarmed Black man again in Minneapolis. The same damned wicked lie. So if, as a socialist, I can't see how race and racism are essential to the functioning of capitalism, and if I'm not actively seeking to dismantle white racism at every level, then I'm not really serious about achieving a more socially just economic system. I'm just not. And the same is true with sexism, heteronormativity, and other forms of supremacy. They are all enmeshed. And there's nothing accidental about any of it. Accidental my ass.
Josh, may I add this as well, just also what it means is, this is over, what this also means is that we cannot allow cultural biases to get in the way of pursuing solidarity. And I'm thinking particularly about the question of trans people. It's hard for, it's very different for many Americans who have not experienced, don't have any experience with trans people. Sometimes it's very difficult for them to be fully understanding and accepting. But the point is, if we have politics based upon egalitarian justice, then we have to realize we just have to get over it. And if and if it's a problem, go home and suffer about it. But that cannot have anything to do with the way that putting up obstacles to brothers and sisters to enjoying the full fruits of life.
Sarah, what would you add to this?
I'm going to set a timer. This is a long question. I don't think I would be a socialist if it weren't for the fact that I realized through the course of traveling through Southeast Asia, which is where I'm from, and sort of just reading more that it, in particular communism and Marxist Leninism, has been a political organizing vehicle for national emancipatory projects, particularly anti-colonial independence movements. Trying to move my cat again. And you know, I alluded to this briefly in my piece as well, but my great aunt, you know, my family is descended more or less from Chinese bourgeois merchants in Malaysia. We're sort of third generation Malaysian, but my great aunt is actually sort of went against her family and decided to essentially enlist in the Communist Party since around high school, and fought essentially for not necessarily for Chinese independence, what have you, but actually for a national collective independence for all peoples in our country back then, Sarawak, which is a state in East Malaysia, which was majority indigenous. And I think of her a little bit because many Chinese people in her position chose to return to China actually, because Mao's revolution was happening back then, and sort of say, you know what, I'm a communist, I'm not being treated super well here. I'm a little bit better than the indigenous peoples, but the British still like own 80% of the capital and land. So I'm just going to go back to China. But so I think for her, to me, just kind of seeing that merging of an ideology that cared about people other than herself, but also that grounded her in a sense of pride in who she was as a colonized subject, but also as a Chinese person. That particular fusion, I think, is a very powerful combination. Because the one thing we do have to acknowledge about identity is that even if with the shortcomings as a mode of organizing people, it connects people on a very deep level. Because it also is often tied to culture, is often tied to belonging and how you're raised. And these categories, I think, are really powerful organizing categories.
Yeah, thank you very much. All very, very thought-provoking responses. And let's continue to bring these reflections forward, right? We've begun by talking about what we think and what we understand deep solidarities to mean, and how important it is to socialism and to Christianity, and how it is that a socialist politics must be an emancipatory politics that's connected with this idea of deep solidarities. But we haven't yet talked exactly about the converse of that. And so I want to put the next question to you, Jeremy. You've been writing a series of wonderful articles for us at The Bias called The Invisible Feet of the Market, which is a basic introduction to capitalism and how it works. And in part one of that, you write the following: colonialism, patriarchy, and racism existed long before capitalism, so we can never treat them as sub-functions of capitalism. Yet colonialism, patriarchy, and racism were necessary for the establishment and remain necessary for the maintenance of capitalist domination. Capitalism cannot achieve its goals without them. We've already begun to talk about this aspect, but I want to carry it forward in a specific way, to talk specifically about, while it may be clear that socialists should be intersectional or involved in deep solidarities, we haven't yet addressed the question of why an intersectional politics ought to be a socialist politics. So why is socialism a central part of true intersectionality for combating all forms of oppression? Put that to you, Jeremy, first.
Yeah, it's such an important thing to be able to look at both sides of this. So Josh, I'm really grateful for you for keeping both of those before us. A phrase that I used that I don't think I used in that piece, but I'm sure it'll come up at some point in the series, is I've been using it in recent years, and that is that capitalism is the ism that funds all the other isms and keeps them in business, right? That wasn't always the case, right? 700 years ago, that wasn't the case. But today, and for at least the past several centuries, it is the case. Capitalism is the ism that funds all the other isms and keeps them in business. And that's the other part of the story. So earlier in the previous question, all of us in a number of ways talked about how part of the truth we have to tell is that capitalism cannot operate at all without engaging these other isms. But the other side, the converse, or I guess it'd be the obverse, is to name that those other isms nowadays in a capitalist society, they live and move and have their being through capitalist structures, right? So we can look at every manifestation of patriarchy, of colonialism, of white supremacy, and we can trace the ways that it is only able to perpetuate through capitalist mechanisms. Or another way I like to say it is racism and patriarchy are not self-funding. They are funded in and through and by the mechanisms of capital movement. So one example of that is to think about one pointed way to think about it is we've got to push our imaginations in terms of what gets defined as, for example, a racial justice or a gender justice issue, right? So typically the fight for 15 and a union is seen as an economic justice issue, but it is not often foregrounded in either racial justice or feminist justice movements, both of which I'm deeply in solidarity with. But we have part of how we re-expand our solidarity imaginations is to realize, yeah, the fight for 15 is a central racial justice goal. Fight for 15 and a union, excuse me, is centrally a racial justice goal, right? It is a central plank in achieving any kind of vision for racial justice, and same for gender justice. So for me, it's about recognizing that every part or every domain of injustice we want to engage right now is ensnared in capitalism, which means an intersectional attack on capitalism is a central part of how we dismantle all those other forms. Sorry, I want to make sure to hear other voices too.
Like that, yeah.
Sorry, I was muted. Right. So it's a bit like there's a capitalist frame which is deploying these different forms of oppression toward its own self-perpetuation. Maybe that's one way of thinking about it. Tim, what would you add?
Yeah, well, I will build on that. So I've learned a lot from Barbara and Karen Fields, a historian and sociologist, two sisters. And in particular, their book, Racecraft, The Soul of Inequality in American Life. In it, they describe racecraft as a mental sleight of hand through which the reality of material inequality rooted in economic exploitation turns into race, right? Lower class and poor becomes Black. Racecraft transforms the actions of dehumanization, something that the ownership class does, into race, something that those targeted by dehumanization are. And when I, as a working class white person, believe that sleight of hand, what happens? I no longer see the ownership class as the cause of my own precarity, as the real threat to my well-being. Instead, I see race. Every time I, as a working person, see racial difference as the problem, rather than capitalist exploitation, I am being duped. I mean, it's like someone is saying, hey, look over here. Inner city crime, welfare queen, the Wuhan virus, migrant hordes from the South. Every time I stare at those red flags and then charge ahead, I really need to stop and pay attention, because someone much more powerful and wealthy is at that very moment taking money out of my pocket. Now, there's a very similar sleight of hand with the environment. The lie is that there are humans and then there's the environment, two separate categories. It's not true. We human beings are nature. We too are creatures. But again, look what happens. It's a similar sleight of hand. Humans are destroying the environment. Humans are overpopulating the planet, especially those humans from Africa, India, and South America. Well, what am I not seeing with this sleight of hand? I'm not seeing that just 100 companies worldwide are responsible for over 70% of all carbon emissions. I'm not seeing that it is the world's super rich who are the chief culprits of ecological degradation. So humans in general are not the problem. Capitalist exploitation is the problem. So with Jeremy, I'd say the exact reverse of what I said before. As an anti-racist, if I'm not actively seeking to dismantle the systems of capital, then I don't think I'm all that serious about achieving racial justice. And if as someone like me who cares deeply about the creation, if I'm not organizing to transition beyond capitalism to a more ecologically just economic system, my concerns might be sincere, but they're not very deep. And they're not ultimately going to change anything at all.
Yeah. I mean, I believe, what is it, the way that the Field Sisters put it, it turns an action of the perpetrator into a characteristic of the victim. And getting caught in that process of imagining that this is the way the world is set up based on the action of a perpetrator is already to have gotten things backwards.
I want to, but I just want to add real quick that a central stake in what Tim has just laid out really magnificently is the possibility of building political alliances gets weakened so much if people are hoodwinked in the ways, Tim, you've outlined, right? So part of the real bite of this is then suddenly people don't recognize the kind of shared interests they have that could lead to really effective coalition building and organizing. I know that it was probably implicit and obvious to everybody, but I want to just name that as part of what's really at stake. And Tim, I'm so glad you've named it.
Sarah, what would you add to this?
Yeah, I mean, just to provide some, I think, meta frameworks to capture all the great things people have said. It sounds like looking at both the combination of emancipatory politics and what you're talking about, racial justice and socialist politics, is important for like historical reasons and practical reasons. I think, Tim, you've done a great job kind of outlining historically why the creation of race itself is linked with kind of this capitalism. I think, Jeremy, you were highlighting how practically, if we want to organize the working class, which is already multiracial and, you know, queer and all that kind of stuff, we have to take these categories, identities seriously. And I think we've mostly talked about race, and I love the example you gave also around labor, because I remember just doing an article for Jacobin looking at his labor unions, and so much of the Chinese Exclusion Act was around, you know, these immigrants are taking our jobs for cheaper, and you see the same arguments obviously of Mexican workers and what have you. And it takes labor union workers a while to realize, wait, what if we just include them in our unions and then, you know, channel all our energy towards organizing against employers instead of channeling all our energy towards excluding the workers who are working for less? What if we try to help them get paid more? And so that is a very concrete example of how, when you switch your analysis, you switch who you think is part of us and who you think is in them. I do want to highlight, just because I think we've mostly talked about race, the ways in which I think queer socialist politics also matter. I know I don't have a ton of time, maybe for just 30 seconds, Josh, to talk a little bit about it. Because in particular around the bathroom scare, so to speak, and all the bills coming out banning trans women for entering women's sports, a lot of it, the figure that's being protected is the figure of the cisgender heterosexual woman. And we must protect her from being attacked in bathrooms or beat in swimming races. I'm a bit unclear about that one. But if it's going back to, you know, the historical and practical framework, I mean, historically, obviously, who really knows, but I think it's a good case to be made that part of the persecution of the sodomite and the homosexual, so to speak, in Europe and also throughout the world is linked with misogyny. It's linked with, you know, in a couple of instances, men who engage in sex with men are seen as more effeminate, less in touch with their virility, more like women, so to speak. But also very specific, and this how it relates to capitalism, as the reproduction of labor is introduced and the sexual division is introduced, where men work in factories and women take care of the home and domestic reproduction. And the capitalist class becomes very interested in the working class reproducing itself because workers, you need more workers to keep your factories alive. I think obviously you see a deprioritization or even a persecution of people who engage in non-reproductive sexual acts. And it's seen as not just a threat socially, but a threat economically. And colonially, you see a similar dynamic where the churches and the colonial enterprise, which is not equivalent with the church, persecution of femme and queer shamans has to do obviously with a clash of religions. You know, I'm Christianity, you're this indigenous religion, but I think really also has to do with capitalism, because so much of these indigenous religions have a very high sacred value place to land and the right way to till it and respect it and revere it, which definitely goes against a mindset in which you're trying to lay property rights and plant some seeds and grow palm trees. So by undermining them, you also remove a basis, a defense against capitalism. So I just think all these things are really connected, and as Christians, we have to take that history seriously.
Yes, it's such a hugely important question, and thank you so much for bringing that to bear on this discussion, just to show how deeply interconnected and interwoven all of these elements are. Obery, what would you add to what we're discussing here? How is it, or what aspects of it? How is it that in emancipatory politics, why is it that it should be a socialist politics?
I thought I addressed that.
Well, that was the other way. That was the other way. I flipped it on you. So why is it that my question previously was why is it that a socialist politics ought to be emancipatory? Now my question is, why should we're looking at it from the other direction? Why is it that if what we're really committed to are transformative public and political works on behalf of the most oppressed and most vulnerable, why should those folks that are committed to those things also take up a socialist politics as well?
Yeah. Well, again, it comes down to, in some ways, to a question of community, of how we will construct healthy communities. But I'd like to, if I might just move toward the question of racism for a moment, and white supremacy. White supremacist hegemony has been so successful and is so deeply embedded in, speaking of this society, in the American psyche, that and in such a deep and demonic way that I'm wondering what kind of politics can address it, to tell you the truth. I don't know that socialist politics as such can address it. I do think, though, that again, if we focus on egalitarian justice, as Jeremy and Sarah sort of focus on, and talk about mutual interests and all that, we can get to it. But I look at unions. Unions have been some of the more racist institutions in this country, and so when we talk about emancipatory politics, I really think, and not to be simplistic, but I think we might want to really take some time to think about what does it mean to try to affect a revolution of values. Tim talked about the peasant culture of his forebears, and that's significant because the two prongs of peasant culture are general reciprocity. We do for each. I do for you because I know you will do for me. I'll help build your barn when you need one because I know you'll help build mine. That's peasant culture, and also the norm of subsistence. Everyone has a right to have enough. And I think that reason I raise that in a biblical context, because that has been the cultural context of almost all the biblical writings and almost all biblical history, speaking from a believer's standpoint, up until I guess we get to the Deutero-Pauline and the pastoral epistles. So I'm suggesting that we talk about a revolution of, if we talk about emancipatory politics, I think prior to that, or as a first step of that, we really look at trying to affect a revolution of values, to try to be engaged in education, to be engaged in redefining or redeclaiming or reclaiming what the biblical witness talks about. For instance, this notion of chesed, steadfast, prismatic love, is a very important concept that's not really talked about. And not only that, the right wing doesn't talk about love at all, but on the left we don't talk about love enough. And I mean, in a deep way, and talk about it in deeply moral and ethical terms, reciprocity, and recognizing a norm of subsistence. So I think that is a kind of emancipatory politic that should be basic, that can go hand in hand with socialist politics, because socialist politics then are the flip side of that, and the brother-sister relationship, I guess.
Yeah. Well,
Obery, I wanted to just push a little bit, though. I very much resonate with what you're saying in terms of, from both directions, identity and class, we've got to push beyond our current ways of thinking, and I absolutely agree. I did though want to say that the role of unions vis-a-vis contesting white supremacy is complicated. So yes, you're right that there's long histories of racism in the labor movement, but at the same time, there are a number of unions, both in the past, but even today, that are doing really great multiracial worker organizing. And I think we can't, ignore that possibility too.
I didn't mean to give that impression. Walter Luther, for instance, major sponsor of Martin Luther King. No, I agree. I mean, they're the major bulwark we have against capitalism. But I'm just talking about the pervasiveness of white supremacy that we have to fight against. But thank you for that.
I think it's hugely important to take note of and deal very directly with the fact that racism has been a huge barrier to building solidarity in unions. Just simply focusing on questions of class is not going to get us there. And also, it's a barrier to talking about socialist politics for many people, for exactly the reasons that Obery brought up. I think it's very important for us to look at it squarely in the same sort of way that we have to deal squarely with like the legacy of Stalinism, right? And these sorts of things. It's very real. Thank you all so much for your answers to these questions. I think they're hugely generative. But someone has brought up something very important in the comments, which is, in our desire to be intersectional, I think we've been maybe overly academic in some ways. So maybe we want to think about the ways in which our answers might address those that maybe don't have as much of a heady theoretical focus that some of us do. It's just something to call attention to. And as we shift, what we've dealt with so far is like, why is it that the question of deep solidarities is important for socialists and Christians? And why is it that a socialist politics must be an emancipatory politics? Why a more general emancipatory politics should be a socialist politics? And now I want to take up this question specifically of the Christian part of our discussion that I also opened with at the beginning. And I want to address this question specifically to you, Tim, as the first responder here, on the basis of something that you wrote, a very provocative paragraph in your piece for tonight's webinar. It's maybe 2 sentences, but it's very long and it's wonderful. You write, quote, "The struggle against exploitative domination and for equitable mutualistic social relations is perhaps the central concern of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. From the exodus of those forced to labor under cruel working conditions to the prophetic denunciations of the wealthy who hoard their spoils stolen from the poor, to Mary's song of praise that the powerful are brought down and the lowly lifted up, to Jesus's upending tables of economic exploitation, the persistent theological claim is that the divine source of all life hears the cries of the oppressed and takes up their side against the pharaohs, taskmasters, money changers, and lords of history. So in this last question to all of our guests tonight, I think I want to quote this because I think it sets up well this last question that I want to ask, which is, why is it that any of this that we've been discussing, deep solidarities, intersectionality, commitment to an emancipatory, anti-capitalist, socialist politics, why is any of this specifically Christian? And I mean this in two senses. And I'm going to ask in our conversations that we explore both aspects of it. Why should Christians be committed to an emancipatory socialism? And what do Christians contribute to the struggle for socialism? So with those questions in mind, I want to ask you, Tim, to respond to this first. And I don't know that I want to repeat the question directly. Can you remember it without me repeating?
Yeah, no. I appreciate the question. And rather than repeating what I wrote, let me phrase it this way. I'm an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church, and so I'm going to speak here specifically from the point of view of the Wesleyan Methodist branches of Christianity. I'll speak more confessionally. We Methodists love to talk about the Wesleyan Way of Salvation. And at the heart, what that is God's gracious solidarity for us in Jesus Christ through the Holy Spirit. So starting with the prevenient grace of God, which is where Methodists begin, or the grace that goes before us, apart from any merit of our own. What does that look like materially? Materially, prevenient grace would be an economic system that guarantees everyone basic access to what they need to live, regardless of how industrious or hardworking they might be. Everyone deserves to live, to eat, to have health care, to belong. Everyone. From there, we Methodists affirm God's justifying grace, or the grace in Jesus that forgives us the debts we owe. Well, that's easy. Economically, this literally means the forgiveness of all debt, medical debt, student loan debt, all forms of debt. And it means the abolishment of every financial system that causes and feeds upon indebtedness, because indebtedness always leads to bondage. I mean, this is at the heart of the Protestant Reformation, the protest against the indulgence system. But I want to go even beyond Luther to figures like Thomas Müntzer and John Hus, my people, my ancestors, right? Justifying grace materialized would be reparative. It would return the wages, the lands, the wealth that has been unjustly stolen, privatized and hoarded, and it would be regenerative. It would return life and vitality to ecosystems that have been degraded. Well, all of a sudden, this grace talk starts to sound quite revolutionary. But I'm not done, because you're not a true Wesleyan if you're not talking about sanctifying grace, or the grace of God that perfects us in the whole of life. Well, this is the love of God and neighbor at work through cooperative ownership structures, through democratic governance in the workplace, and equitable compensation for all who labor. This would entail practices of production and distribution that do no harm to my human or more than human neighbors. In fact, this would be a political and economic system that actively does good. It would cultivate just relations. It would foster bodily health. It would provide joy and beauty in everyday life, and it would guarantee rest. I'm talking 4-day weekends, 6-hour work days, feast days and communal festivals, months of vacation a year, and year-long sabbaticals for everyone. This is what the scriptures mean by salvation. This is the scriptural way of salvation.
Well, let me back up and just say, what is it in this, Tim, that you think Christians contribute to the socialist struggle?
So I've got more to share on that. I actually would love to hear from my other panelists first, because I would love to talk about that. But sure. Let's get the other voices in first.
Sure, Sarah. Why is any of this specifically Christian? Why should Christians be committed to an emancipatory socialism, and what do Christians contribute to the struggle for socialism?
I'm just going to be very practical here because being attentive to the comments, some of you belong to congregations, to churches, some of you might preach in churches. I want to give you all some practical things you can bring back to your congregations. I don't have an objective reason why. I think it's just about a good reason is one that convinces people. So I'm going to drop into the chat box. So I preach about once a month, and the way I preach in a congregation is pretty different than how I've talked just now. Perhaps I think I assumed it was a sort of more academic audience given the attendees, but hopefully this gives you a little bit more language you can pull. I'm definitely the only person who's preached on this. I highly recommend checking out Jubilee Baptist Church, which is a very explicitly socialist church in North Carolina. But whether you're talking about, obviously coming from evangelical non-denominational background, the Bible is really important to my congregation. So we have to quote passages for anything we preach. So Book of Acts, great place to talk about property being common, and you can easily back that up with so many of the early church father sayings talking about how the bread you have in your shelf is a bread you've stolen from a poor person, and really kind of seeing interdependence, not just like the bread you could have given if you were nice to a poor person, but truly like the wealth you have is predicated on the poverty of someone else. So really taking Acts to like the next level. I put in a specific workplace sermon I was preached out specifically geared towards people who suffered under abusive bosses, which really kind of hit a chord for a lot of people. And I pulled from Psalm 10 for that one and just shared with my story. And then this whole language we're talking about cross-racial solidarity, ways in which white supremacy and capitalism divides the working class into racial categories, blah, blah, blah. Really good example is Exodus, a mixed multitude. When the people of Israel are leaving Egypt, there's this kind of brief passage where there's a mixed multitude went up with them. There's a lot of speculation. Who is this mixed multitude? Is it just like randos? And some scholars think that it is, definitely a Hebrew scholar, that they are some of the involved non-Israelites, Egyptians who also didn't like Pharaoh, who also felt mistreated, maybe not to the same extent as the Hebrew slaves, but also were like, we're not getting a good deal. We're going to go with these people because these people seem to be interested in liberation and seem to be interested in all of that stuff. And I think that's a perfect example of recognizing ways in which we have shared interests and we can work together for all our collective liberation instead of just being like, well, at least I'm better than a Hebrew slave, you know, which is kind of often the position I think maybe more white working class people take. So I think there's so much great Bible stuff. I'm sure there's tons more. These are just some practical things I want to leave people with.
Thank you so much, Sarah. and such wonderful practical ways of addressing these questions, because I work very closely with people that are preparing for ministry, and these are the questions that always come up when you encounter the difficulty and the complexity of capitalism and its interwoven nature with all of these different forms of oppression. It can leave people feeling overwhelmed and like there's nothing more to do. But there are some very practical things, especially when we bond together in solidarity. Obery, you've talked tonight about mishpat, about hesed, so many of these questions that resonate, especially in the opening chapters of the Politics of Jesus, that I could point to. Let me ask you this question: why is any of this specifically Christian? Why should Christians be committed to this emancipatory socialism as Christians?
Well, I don't think that is particularly Christian. I think, though, that it is that Christians do have a responsibility to do these things. That makes sense. Let me tell you what I mean. Take the totality of Jesus' teachings, and we see he was an ethical a teacher of ethics. He was an ethical teacher. He taught almost nothing about theology or what we should believe or doctrine or anything like that. Which means that his teachings, ethical teachings about how to build and maintain healthy and just societies, that can be used by believers, non-believers alike. So that's not peculiarly Christian. And so one question was, I saw in the chat, is what I'm talking about, the body of Christ. No, I'm not talking about the body of Christ. I'm always talking about the body of humanity that we should be focused on. Also, if I can recall the second part of my point, why is it? Well, it's Christian. If I remember the question correctly, now I'm the oldest guy in this group, so I hope I get a bit of a break here. If I remember the question correctly, pose it again. Indulge me and pose it in one sentence again, please.
Sure, absolutely. Why is any of this, deep solidarities, intersectional commitment, emancipatory socialist politics, why is any of this specifically Christian? And something that you said earlier really resonated, which I think is that you raised the question of love, and you said we don't talk about love enough, but you also said the ways that we talk about love are not adequate to the biblical picture, to the picture of the way in which Jesus talked about love and things like that. And maybe that might be part of the way in which you might begin to address that question. Mm-hmm. Why is any of this specifically Christian?
Well, I think it's specifically Christian. Well, it depends on how you understand Christianity. I mean, we know that there are all kinds of contradictory things in the scriptures, and even some in the New Testament, between the gospel and the Pauline and supposedly Pauline letters and all that. And so what does that mean? It means we have to evolve. We have to be clear on what the gospel is, what the core of the gospel is. We must come to some understanding of what that core of the gospel is, through which we refract all of our prescriptions and our analyses and understandings. And I'd like to offer, I think Jesus does it well. He says that love your neighbor as yourself is just like the primary commandment, which is love your Lord your God on your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So that has to be part of the core, love your neighbor as yourself. But also, he gives one primary mode of judgment in Matthew 25:31-46, right? And it is essentially, it says, as you have done it to the least of these, you have done it to me. And if you have not, go off into hell. That's essentially what it says. And what does it say to do? It says to look out for other people, take care of other people, to make sure that they have the basic necessities of life. It has nothing to do with who you sleep with, who you look like, who you marry. It has nothing to do with any of that. And so for me, if that is the core of the gospel, and I believe it is, then that dictates that we do something like socialism Anyway, something like emancipatory socialism, emancipatory struggle, something like egalitarian justice. You couple that with the other, core sayings of his, like Luke 4:16, and it's like, if you are Christian, this is what you are supposed to do. If you are, not only that, if you are a biblical believer, because our foundational ethics come from the Hebrew Bible, right? Mishpat, the concept of justice, sadaqah, doesn't mean righteousness. It means doing right, doing justice in society, which means, and put the two together, the most often occurring pairing of ethical terms in the Bible, what you get is doing justice in society, or social justice. That is basic to our faith, inescapable. And so it says to be a follower of the gospel, then one has no choice but to try to embrace and put those into action as much as possible. And let me just say this, that means that's why we must anchor our witness and our analysis in these foundational biblical ethics, in the foundational biblical witness. And so our people can understand what we're saying, whether we like it or not. Aunt Polly or Aunt Jane in the pew is not going to understand a lot of theological concepts, much less concepts of political economy. We have to break them down and speak in their frame in order to get them. We have to do this deep digging work, theological work, in our political and economic analysis. But I think, in my opinion, that it must be refracted through the biblical witness in order for it to make sense to people and for it to be a compelling part of their faith.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much. Jeremy, what would you add?
Yeah, a couple pieces. The first I would say is I want to flip the question a little bit. And that is, rather than thinking, why is it Christians ought to be committed to socialism? I think the churches have to reckon with, is there any basis in which it's legitimate for Christianity or for Christian churches to uphold capitalism? And I think the answer has to be no. And part of the work that I hope both ICS and Wendland-Cook promote is flipping that question, because for too long, churches in Western contexts have simply accepted capitalism as our baseline, right? And we sort of like, are there Christian tweaks to it? Well, it's time to name. I mean, I want to say we need to reclaim two kinds of thinking that have often been deployed to exclude queer people from Christian communities, and we need to now turn them to the dismantling of capitalism. One of them is to say, it's time for churches to boldly proclaim capitalism is incompatible with Christian teaching and it is offensive to the gospel. That there is no way to reconcile a commitment to the gospel that Obery has just outlined and that Timothy and Sarah have affirmed in different aspects. There's no way to affirm that kind of gospel and perpetuate in any form capitalist exploitation and all of its connections to gender and racial and ableist and colonialist violence and exploitation. We have to declare capitalism is incompatible with Christian teaching. It is fundamentally offensive to the gospel. And that has to be, in Protestant terms, that has to have the weight of a status confessionis, right? We've got to stand on that. And I would say the other phrase that I want to reclaim is the notion of the order of creation, right? So this would touch on where Obery is pointing us, as well as resonating with Timothy's vision too, ecologically. And that is, let's go back to the creation accounts. And what do we find there? We find there an order of creation in which everything exists in a way that gives life to everything else, right? In a system that does not exploit, but rather provides mutualistically. That is the order of creation in which and for which we were made, right? In and with divinity. And so we need to, that provides another place, along with the multiple other theological concepts or parts of the Christian witness that have been named. The very order of creation calls for socialism. And that's got to be on the table as something we consider. And that would then allow me to get to the last part of your question, Josh. I don't think Christians have any business trying to contribute to socialism unless and until we have reckoned with the ways that Christianity has propped up capitalism in so many ways. That's not to say that Christianity has not been a resource for contesting capitalism. It absolutely has, for sure. But in too many churches, there is a just acceptance of the capitalist order as coherent with Christianity. And until we can confront that, until every church says and proclaims Christianity and capitalism are fundamentally incompatible, we don't have any business trying to like offer something to socialism, but rather instead be convicted by socialism out of our deep affinity with capitalism.
But every church, may I say, but I mean, brother, I'm going to say amen, 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 except every church is not going to do that. So I mean, might we amend that statement a little, or am I taking it out of context?
No, you're right. And I should say that's, I mean, I guess, right, whenever we encounter those, what we say is, well, eschatology, right? Like that is to say, we aspire to the boldness of that witness, but I want to resonate with something both you and Sarah pointed out. We have to find ways to open this as a possibility rather than just this sort of just thundering down, or someone in the Q&A mentioned the value of calling in rather than calling out. And I should have acknowledged earlier that is really key. And I think both you and Sarah have named ways of creating on-ramps, both mentally and practically, for imagining our way into Christian anti-capitalists.
Right, and Jeremy, that's a point that I want to come back to actually in this last little bit. I want to address that. I want to address that particular question to the group, but I want to say too. I mean, this is there are so many ways in which Christianity has become bound up with this sort of capitalist mode of thinking, and capitalist society has come to shape the way Christianity even understands itself. Right. So, but at the same time, there are ways of living, right, which we've talked about the body of Christ. We've talked about different ways in which there's something else that wants to happen. And it's also something that Sarah pointed to in their piece, which was dealing with the fact that there are ways in which communist work, socialist work wants to be like a church or is like a church, but yet there's something at the same time that there is to learn from this. I'm really interested in exploring in these different ways what that might be. Tim, you said that there was something that you wanted to add to this question, though, and I don't want to leave it before you've had a chance to add that.
Yeah, I mean, Jeremy's points are essential. I think we do need to name that there have been multiple Christianities throughout the history of the church. There have been imperial Christianity, and there have been grassroots people's Christianities. There's been plantation Christianity, and there's been Black Christianities in resistance and rebellion. There have always been contestations of Christianity. It's why Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer said Kirchenkampf, church struggle, lies at the very heart of the struggle over the gospel. And so that's what we're talking about here. The reality is that the imperial church, the white plantation church today has been ascendant, has been organized, has been organizing money and think tanks and praise and worship songs and campus and college gatherings and political organizing toward a very particular political vision, right? They've been organized. The Christian left, those of us who believe that the heart of the gospel is Jesus's commandment to love thy neighbor as thyself. And that means anti-racism. That means caring justly for the environment. That means queer liberation and inclusion. Right? Those of us committed to that understanding of the gospel are disorganized. We don't collaborate. We don't unite our resources. We're not systematically linking up our analyses and our power together to transition beyond capitalism toward a more socially and economically and culturally just society. So this is a crucial aspect of why the Institute for Christian Socialism was founded, why we're so excited to partner with the Wendland-Cook Program in Religion and Justice, is because we need to come together. We need to think together, we need to reason together, and we need to act together.
So let me ask this question, and it'll be the last one that I ask for the night, because I think there have been several things that have come through in the chat that coalesce around this. But it's a question which Barbara Wendland has framed here, and it's about well, let me just say there. All of these, in answer to this question, please try to give some specific examples of the ways in which you have done this work, or where you have seen this kind of work being done. But the question that's posed is, how would Jeremy's statement about capitalism go over in typical churches, especially small congregations in rural areas with a mostly older membership? And this has been sort of around the edges of our discussion tonight. Criticisms of being too academic, maybe, in the answers that we give, or saying the ways in which we need to question our own complicity in capitalism, and Obery's excellent point that, like, that's not going to happen in a lot of churches, right? So, I mean, and this bit about calling in and calling out, like, all of these intersect with one another. And I just want to put this to you, Sarah, first. How would you answer this question?
I really don't think I'd be a great person to answer this question, because I've only grown up in coastal multiracial contexts. I'm going to recommend DSA's Building the Religious Left conference. I just put it in the chat, which will have ministers from the Midwest, from small towns, older populations, and that will be on April 24th to 25th. The one thing I think about is that I have ongoing conversations with a friend of mine. So I started a Christian leftist reading group in my church, and actually I thought it would be like 5 people. It has like 40 people on the mailing list, from people who are kind of like, oh, I've always kind of wanted to check that out and read Marx for the first time. But now someone I trust, someone I know in the church is inviting me to do it. That's kind of overcome the initial obstacle. So I think that you might be surprised perhaps by who shows up if you put out the call. I was definitely surprised. And the other thing I can think about also is when my church, after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, all that, the kind of the national conversation on race and police brutality, our church was on Zoom, and so we had this habit of, after the Facebook live streaming, we would then gather on Zoom. So I should have clarified that. When all this was happening, as a staff, we made the decision to create, at first, spaces of separation, so to speak. So for our Black congregants to gather and process, non-Black POC, and then white congregants to set emphasis. And I could see some socialists pushing back and saying you're going against solidarity by segmenting us from the beginning. But I do think it was an important kind of healing space for people to, particularly for our Black congregants, to speak, without having to think how would someone else, respond to this. But what we did after having several of those conversations separately, we said, let's come together and can we have a church-wide conversation, and share, instances in which congregants and particularly Black congregants at a congregation, but also anyone, microaggressions, from Sunday service to small groups. And it might feel very small, how do you get from microaggressions to, I guess, Christian socialism? But I think what we're able to build is more trust and more relationships, such that the white anti-racist group, now we have like a regular small group, I think was able to lead a pretty good discussion on police abolition, which I think is a really good segue bridge between racial justice and socialism, because to talk about police abolition, you have to talk about the causes of crime, you talk about poverty. So I just think there are all these kind of opportunities and moments, whether nationally, that you can start yourself, that just kind of builds on the momentum that's happening, and see what is the next step that makes sense from there.
Jeremy, you'll get the last word here.
Sure. Well, I don't need the last word, but I just want to add, I want to resonate very much with what Sarah just laid out. Barbara, your question is so important. It's about practical strategies. So I just want to very briefly say, to my mind, I think of it as a sequence of learning and engagement process. So the beginning is frankly, congregations involved in providing care and support for the victims of capitalism. But we might not talk about capitalism in that way. It might be about how do we feed the community? How do we think about who has housing and who needs housing in our community? So things like Habitat for Humanity. So it begins with those direct service things. And then I think the key second stage is to then begin to understand how those needs arise from a system. And in looking at the causes of them, only at the end of that second process might we even mention capitalism, the word capitalism. And then later, it becomes the question of how do we contest capitalism? But I want to acknowledge it begins from direct engagement with serving and caring for and supporting people who are affected by capitalism, and then asking, why are people being treated this way? Why is there so much suffering? To be able to name the system, and then it becomes saying, so then what is our response to the system? But that's a long period of work, but we have all the time in the world because this is the work.
Josh, can I just add a word here?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, I agree with Jeremy. We don't have to, it's not incumbent upon us to use the term capitalism. I think what we can do and should do is anchor our critique in descriptions of what contradicts the gospel, the exploitations and the injustice. And we can do that, for instance, in looking through the Lord's Prayer. I mean, in it, as we know, Jesus critiques the political system. Wants God's kingdom of justice to come to remove Caesar's kingdom of injustice. Talks, it speaks economic injustice with exploitive debt and all that. And then I think we can talk about the kingdom of God or the sole sovereignty of God, what that would look like. I guess what I'm saying is it's important to try to anchor our conversation in what the gospel requires of us, what its vision of a just and healthy and righteous society is, and in so doing, I mean, that indicts what's going on, right now in this society, and but I think if I could summarize it, I think the way to approach all of this is to anchor it firmly in the gospel sayings. Our critiques would be the critiques that Jesus offers, and we expand upon them, of course. And then we can say, yes, now what stands in the way that, the systemic abuses that he talked about in Luke 4:16, they're called capitalism. But I think we first have to show people how much they're suffering. In Matthew 20, Jesus talks about to the workers in the vineyard, and he holds up in bold relief the kind of exploitation that they apparently don't even realize that they've been going through. And that raises their consciousness. So I guess what I would say, we must use our gospel resources as a means of raising consciousness to get to the point where we can get people to say, well, what can we do? What should we do? What is the problem here? But I do want to say that I resonate with everything that Jeremy is saying. I just like to add that to it.
Absolutely. And I think it's an important note, as you're pointing out, that Christianity can be a source of conscientization, right? Like Freire says. That brings us to the end of our webinar tonight. Thank you to everyone, to our guests, to the folks at home, everyone who's on Zoom, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. Thank you, Obery. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Tim. Everyone who's watching tonight's webinar was sponsored by the Institute for Christian Socialism and the Wendland-Cook Program for Religion and Justice at Vanderbilt Divinity School. We have yet another webinar coming next month addressing the question of what is to be done. The Institute for Christian Socialism is a nonprofit organization, and we are committed to building a movement of the ecumenical Christian left, all of the things that we've been discussing here tonight. And you can learn more about us at www.christiansocialism.com, and you can follow us on Twitter at the handle #SmashMammon. To support our work, you can go to www.christiansocialism.com/support. And the Wendland-Cook Program for Religion and Justice at Vanderbilt Divinity School is an interdisciplinary program that's focused on issues of justice that arise at the intersection of religion, economics, and ecology. You can find them at www.religionandjustice.org and on Twitter at religionandj. You can support their work at www.religionandjustice.org/donate. I've been your host tonight, Josh Davis. Please go in peace to love one another and smash mammon. Goodbye.